All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome on 99 Media, even though in a slightly different setup than normally, because there's also a live audience today. Today we've got the honor of having Professor Mick Dunford with us, who is an emeritus professor at the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex, and visiting professor at the Institute of Geographical Sciences and Natural Resources Research, Chinese Academy of Sciences, and managing editor of Area Development and Policy. Thank you very much, Mick, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And it's a very nice feeling, to think that I'm speaking to people in Pisa.
No, we're glad to have you. And so I've read a few of your articles recently, and the topic of today's talk is about China and its evolution as a, let's say, country that is trying to build a really existing socialism. So I've got a few questions, and then if the audience will have some, we're going to open up the debate for questions from the audience. So I'm going to start reading the first one. So recently I had the opportunity of reading a few articles of yours, and in particular regarding the Chinese development path from 1949 to 2022. And quite a few things struck me. Possibly the one that surprised me the most is the organic and historical conception that the Chinese leadership has of its own role. And to start our questions, I would like to ask you if you could outline the periodization of the path to socialism offered by many Chinese intellectuals. Cheng Enfu, for example, has recently published an article on the May issue of Monthly Review, which is largely coincident to what I've read from your articles. And from what I gathered, the Chinese conception of the path towards socialism is a three-stage process, and we are still living the initial phase. So this very phase is itself divided into three periods: seizing the state power, which will be the Maoist period, the reform and opening up period with Deng Xiaoping, and the new era that started approximately with the 17th Communist Party of China Congress of 2012 and Xi's ascent to power. Could you help us making sense of this long-durée approach to Chinese development?
Okay. I think Cheng Enfu's joint article is really extremely good. If you want to understand China, it would be very, very useful at least to read the fourth section, which actually points to some extent to a way ahead. I think actually when he spoke about seizing the state, he must have referred to the whole era of the revolution, the Civil War, the establishment of the new China in 1949 and so on. I tend to think, that as in Chinese philosophy, everything is in a state of change. So it doesn't often make sense, to ask, is China capitalist or is China socialist? I think one can ask, basically where one is at any moment in time, and then, where one came from and where one wants to go. So you should look at, China, you should look at China's development, you should look at everyone's development as a kind of path. In the case of China, the way I tend to look at it is to think that they embarked on a path to socialism, that along the way there were a series of crises and contradictions, and at each stage they engaged in a process of deliberation, out of which emerged a series of reforms that were designed to address the problems and to enable them to move forward along the path. So I tend to divide it in exactly the same way as Cheng Enfu does, from the time that the People's Republic of China was established. Initially, the aim was to carry through a new democracy revolution. But China actually inherited an inflationary crisis from the previous regime. And in that crisis, when it started to try to resolve that crisis, the national bourgeoisie engaged in speculative conduct. And then in 1950, China had to enter the Korean War. And it was at that point in time that it essentially abandoned this new democracy revolution and really sought to establish a kind of socialist state, almost on the model of the Soviet Union, with state-owned enterprises, a national planning system, Danwei welfare, and so on. But also with a land reform, which is one of the most important steps, giving land to the rural population. As a result, of the conflict, in Korea, China then found itself embargoed by the United States. So really, I would say the first phase of its development is that whole period up to 1972, when China was embargoed by the United States and by the Western world. And in that period, China's development was very tumultuous. Actually, on average, it grew at about 6% per year. But for the first period, basically, there were 156 Soviet projects, major industrial projects in the northeast and in parts of central China. So China established a modern industrial system, through those joint projects. But then, the relationship deteriorated after the denunciation of Stalin in 1956. But the relationship with the Soviet Union deteriorated. And when they were starting the second five-year plan, they faced a problem, namely, a lack of state budget finance, and the fact that they had to repay loans to the Soviet Union. So in that context, they decided on decentralization. They decided on, the Great Leap Forward was actually a choice to move initiative down to the locality in the absence of the resources at a central level to continue on the path on which they had earlier embarked. So you follow the story through. In 1964, the United States enters the Vietnam War. So China launched the Third Front. The Third Front, in the Third Front strategy, they use 48% of their capital investment basically to construct infrastructure and to move strategic industries to mountainous areas in the center and west of China. And then, the next step, you have the Cultural Revolution, which was meant to last 2 years. But that period is very striking if you actually look at one indicator. For 80% of people were rural. If you look at China's life expectancy, which soared through that first 20 to 30 years, the population doubled, life expectancy soared, educational attainment soared, but the large increase in life expectancy really coincided with the start of the Cultural Revolution, when they developed health and education systems in the countryside, barefoot doctors and so on. So in that period, you had a very turbulent phase of development, confronting a series of crises and trying to find problems. And then in 1972, the problems with the United States are alleviated. And at that point, the government of Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong actually embarked on something quite close to reform, because they started taking out Western loans, acquiring Western technology, and developing industries on the coast. So in a sense, that anticipated reform and opening up. But, reform and opening up, they had a similar problem. They had to repay these debts. The central government lacked budgetary resources. So again, they moved initiative down. Reform and opening up was very substantially a decentralization of initiative, trying to mobilize the mass of the Chinese people. But they also made a decision to let some people get rich first, because they thought that would, and some places to get rich first, because they thought that would accelerate the development of the productive forces. And then, after the Asian financial crisis, they confront certain difficulties, because you've got this explosion of inequality. Social inequality, rural-urban inequality, regional inequality, and a large increase in mass incidents. So you start to see a new phase of reform. And I think you can trace it on through, into the new era, when, which I would say actually started with the 18th Party Congress, because the 17th Party Congress was chaired by Hu Jintao, and at that conference, Xi Jinping was announced as the new leader, anointed as the new leader of China. So that's the first thing. You can follow that story through, and we'll pick up on some parts of that story later. Now, if I just come back to Cheng Enfu. I mean, in China, they speak of this first era as being the initial stage of socialism, which is characterized by what? Distribution according to labor, the development of the productive forces, a property rights system that combines public ownership with private ownership, a system of regulation that involves basically a plan-guided market economy, and vitally, the four cardinal principles, which basically consolidate the leadership of the CPC. I would argue that China, it's a kind of, you could say that embodies the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat and all process democracy. But China substantively is a democracy in the sense that it delivers improvements in the quality of life of virtually all of its citizens. And if it is substantively democratic in terms of outcomes, then in a way its procedures must also be democratic. And it's quite interesting, to look at this process of all process democracy to understand how it works. So that's really the state from 1978, 79 until the new era. Cheng Enfu used to speak of a sort of secondary and tertiary phase of this initial phase of development of socialism. And Xi Jinping recently has actually started to speak about movement to a higher stage of socialism and the establishment of a great modern socialist country. And if you read the article, I mean, I can't elaborate on all of these things, but he talks about this new phase as, he calls it a transitional revolution to a higher stage of socialism involving the development of the productive forces and natural wealth, and then the elimination of the three major economic privileges and the establishment of three major economic fairnesses, a transformation of the economic regulation system. Politically, the demise of the three political subjects and the realization of the three political forms, with government moving progressively in the direction of the administration of things. And ideologically, in this transitional revolution, the elimination of three narrow prejudices and the establishment of three forms of noble thought. And of course, an attempt to consolidate Marxism and to move away from liberalism as a kind of ideology that shapes the trajectory of the country. So, in a sense, this is the kind of ambition, moving forward, and ultimately moving beyond that, to a higher stage of socialism, and ultimately, towards a society in which people receive what they need rather than simply what they earn through their work. So the whole trajectory is partly seen in these terms, but one where at each point, one has to address a set of problems. The other point that's important about the context is, of course, that it was Bush who first announced that China was a strategic rival in the early part of the new millennium. And then the United States was deflected, by 9/11. And then you had the pivot to Asia under Obama. And then in 2017, the United States recognized China and Russia as strategic rivals. And of course, in this period, China has had to confront a much more difficult international context. So it's a very kind of brief and incomplete story.
Yes, actually, you have anticipated many of the points I was going to ask in the sequent question, but it's absolutely fine because I can just select some others. But I want to indulge a little bit more into these, let's say, dialectical and pragmatic conception of the path towards socialism, because in many Western circles, including and possibly especially in certain Eurocentric Western Marxist circles, the question, is China socialist, is often conceptualized in a binary and not dialectical way. So as if socialism was a predetermined set of characteristics, often elaborated in a very utopian and messianic way, as if they were an a priori and not a process, which I guess links to what you were saying before. So in light of what we have learned about the Chinese self-awareness in building a socialist society, what would you answer to the claim that some of these commentators make, that China has gone capitalist, or that the reform and opening up process was a betrayal of the revolution. I'm actually reading some quotes of things that I found online, or even that China is imperialist. That seems to be fairly popular among certain, let's say, Western, including Western Marxist commentator. So I wanted, if possible, if you could clarify your position on this.
You read several articles, right? And you showed me the questions. Your 6 questions are really very, very good. And I mean, I can say something different in relation to all of them, so you needn't worry. I thought I would say answer this by saying two things in 2 ways, right? I mean, the first thing, what kind of society is it? The states, the banks are state-owned in China. The critical economic sectors are owned by the state and by collectives. In the last few years, they've been responsible for 38% of capital investment. The land is publicly owned, although it's leased on long leases. Private ownership does coexist with public ownership, right? But, the capitalist class is not the ruling class. Decidedly not. I mean, one only has to look at the action against private capitalists, in recent years. The commodification of labor power is incomplete and in some ways limited, because all rural households are assigned land on which they can build a home, a so-called jiaiji on which they can grow food, and they, without payment, have contracted land on which they can cultivate crops or raise animals, whose produce they can sell. So almost all these migrant workers came from rural households that basically are able to sustain themselves because they have food, they can make their own clothing, they have shelter, and so on. I mean, there are issues to do with health and education, and serious ones, which have started to be addressed in the new millennium. So these are characteristics of China which make it quite clear that it's quite different, from most other countries in the world, maybe from any other country in the world, or certainly from any country that doesn't call itself socialist. The World Trade Organization does not recognize China as a market economy. When it joined the WTO, it was recognized as a non-market economy. It was given 15 years to become a market economy. After those 15 years, it was not given market economy status. So that's the first thing I want to say. I just want to say something now about the development of socialism. I'm going to say something about some way Chinese people think about this, which is quite different, from the way in which it's sometimes thought about in the Western world. Basically first, capitalism emerged, I would say after 1498, when Europeans used Chinese inventions, magnetic compass, watertight compartments in ships, gunpowder. They put guns on ships and they colonized the world. And they engaged in a wave of mercantile expansion and then industrial expansion. They emerged in a world of tributary civilizations, tributary states. And, the continuity of these civilizations is in some ways in contradiction with liberal universalism and indeed with imperialism. And it's perhaps a fundamental characteristic of the world in which we live at the present. And it may be something that very profoundly shapes, the world into which we move in the future. Now, if we come to Marx, Marx actually thought socialism was a kind of endpoint after the development of the productive forces. But, I would argue that what Marx presented was a kind of logical history, because socialist revolutions didn't occur in the most developed countries. They emerged in the less developed countries in the global south and east. And it's interesting to read what Marx said in response to Vera Zasulich, towards the end of his life, when he was actually asked about whether the Russian commune could immediately transition to socialism without going through, a phase of capitalism. And in Italy, not in Italy, but this conflict occurred in Italy. In China, there's a so-called theory of the Caudine Forks. This refers to the Second Samnite War. Right? In 321 BC, the Samnites defeated and humiliated the Roman army, a very powerful Roman army, basically using strategy and deception. And some Chinese theorists talk about this theory of the Caudine Forks to ask whether countries in the global south can actually transition almost directly to socialism. So, for example, this is one Marxist scholar in China who said, China never experienced a stage of development of capitalist social forms, but on the contrary, it has a brilliant history of pre-capitalist classical civilization. Since modern times, it has tirelessly explored the unique path of socialist revolution and construction under the external impact of Western capitalist civilization. And he argues that what they put in place was a mixed, form. In other words, a combination. Okay? So this is actually quite an interesting way of looking at things. Because in a way, the allowing the emergence of capitalism within this context was basically instrumental in developing the productive forces. And this account raises another interesting question, because you can ask, can developed capitalist countries make a transition to socialism on their own? And then I find it interesting to ask, in context of the world as we live in today, might it be the case that the Western world changes because of the way the global south and east changes around it and the way its position in the world is transformed? So I think we need to think about these ideas, because Marx presented powerful logical arguments. All his argument about modes of production was a logical argument, and Samir Amin provided a different account, which is a historical, an empirical argument. And I think we need to think about history and then use these analytical tools to think about the actual historical process.
No, it makes sense. I want to move away onto a question that is more connected to, let's say, international relations. And okay. The question is, how do you interpret the shift in the US foreign policy towards China that you sort of referred to before? If one remembers the 90s and the efforts of the Clinton administration, for example, to bring China into the WTO, which then materialized in 2001, only 10 years later, we, as you said, we have had the Obama's pivot to Asia, and which was clearly quite a massive shift. And could you expand on how the US conceptualized the phase of Chinese opening up, both from a geopolitical and an economic point of view, and was in a way Chinese refusal to comply with the US expectations, which one could summarize, like the title could be less Japanify China. I don't know if that's a word, but the Japanification of China
Japanification,
is probably what they had in mind.
Okay.
So yeah.
No, I think it's absolutely clear that the US and Western intellectuals and liberal intellectuals hoped, even expected, that there would be a process in which the CPC would be swept from power and a liberal elite would adopt Western political and economic institutions. And in all probability, since China is a very large country, it has between 1/5 and 1/6 of the total population in the world, probably that it was divided into a number of independent states, whose governments would essentially be compliant. To this end, the United States has always used soft power, attempted subversion, economic leverage, in order to achieve these goals. I think the change, of course, in the United States occurred because of China's growing economic, military, and political strength. The indication that the CPC had the support of the overwhelming majority of Chinese people. The US was deeply concerned once China embarked on indigenous innovation, and also once it started to establish parallel, maybe alternative, international institutions. Its role in the BRICS, right? The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the establishment of a new development bank. So why? In my view, right? But the US is an imperialist power. It has always opposed socialism, on the grounds that it needs open capital and trade markets, as long as it is the most competitive economy in the world. Its enterprises are the most competitive in the world. Anyone that challenged its leadership was challenged. So you can say Great Britain. Great Britain transferred technology to the United States, including under Lend-Lease agreements. So its know-how was transferred, and it emerged deeply indebted. In 1971, the United States basically dismantled the Bretton Woods system, forced a revaluation on European currencies because the European countries were running trade surpluses with the United States after the Vietnam War. Well, not after, but during the Vietnam War. In 1986, it stopped the progress of Japan. So basically, China and other rising powers jeopardize US and Western hegemony. So that's the fundamental reason. Now, beyond that, the situation in the United States is not good. Productivity growth has progressively slowed down. China outcompetes the United States and indeed Europe in many industrial sectors. Its competitive strength, is a serious challenge. The US and the G7, they run large current trade deficits and large budget deficits. And so they accumulate debt. In the United States, a huge mountain of debt. So these countries are dependent on capital inflows. So you just look at the balance of payments accounts. These capital inflows include returns on assets in the rest of the world, foreign investments, loans to indebted global South countries. And they also depend on the rest of the world lending them money so that they can essentially spend, more than they earn. Because the world needs more euros, needs more dollars, basically because it plays a role in the financing of international trade. So it also controls intellectual property, but China's indigenous innovation challenges US intellectual property leadership in some of the industries of the future, and therefore the huge rents that US corporations earn. The US has probably lost, it's lost military supremacy to Russia and China. Due to the weaponization of the dollar and the sanctions regime, the use of the dollar is in decline, which jeopardizes its ability to spend more than it earns. It needs real collateral for its debt. And you've got to remember its debt. The debt service is immense. It's nearly the same magnitude as the US annual defense budget. So it's interested in Iranian and Russian energy resources and so on. So, okay, so this is very important. You've got this context of, the relative decline of the United States and the West, and the relative rise of economically, militarily, politically of China and indeed other countries. So is China imperialist, right? I mean, to me, imperialism is the use of military, political, and ideological power to impose one's will on other countries. So, in our world, the main imperialist power is the United States. It breaches an agreement with Gorbachev. After plundering Russia, for 10 years, it expands NATO. The neoconservatives plan to overthrow 7 governments in 5 years. So, to me, that is imperialism. China does not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. It doesn't overthrow other countries' governments, doesn't seek to impose its will on other countries. So I would say, the UK and some European countries are sub-imperial powers. Israel is another sub-imperial power. In their regions, Australia and New Zealand are sub-imperial powers. But, beyond that, I know where the theory comes from. I don't completely, agree. I think there's an issue of economic imperialism, and we'll come to that. But I think this is very, very important. Very, very important that we understand these things. Just on the economic side, I'll just say something, okay? That if you say what causes uneven development, I would say uneven development is a consequence of differences in competitiveness. Okay, so, and these differences in competitiveness are also associated with capital export, which generates revenue streams in the opposite direction. If you've got relatively evenly developed countries, I think the flows probably balance out. But if you've got an immense disparity in the productive capabilities of countries that are trading with one another, then you will see net resource flows away from, if you like, the countries that are relatively weak competitively. So to me, the critical question about the world ahead, because China has an interest in the development of other countries. It's an expansion of markets, investment opportunities, trade opportunities, and also it improves the livelihoods of people, in other parts of the world. But, the critical question is, can the rest of the global South achieve what China has achieved? Can it increase productivity? Can it establish competitive industries? Can it get out from under the terrible burden of debt? So that's the way I would answer it. I think this political use of political, military, ideological power to impose your will on other parts of the world, including your allies. You only have to look at what the United States is doing to Europe. It is terrible, sacrifice anyone or anything, in order to secure its own interests. So that's how I would reply to these people, who so I think it's a nonsensical claim, that China is imperialist. There is a problem in that it is highly competitive, but it says it's going to share its technology, and that will be an important test. Will it share technology in a way in which, US, global corporations have not?
Yes, so this is clearly related to what I was going to ask you just now, because if we move into this discussing the international role of China and its actions in promoting so-called South-South cooperation, I think you highlighted the centrality of capital investment in any development process, and you stressed that this may come only through in an internal accumulation via a conscious depression of wages to build up economic surplus. Or at least this is what China has done in the open gap period, or via relying on international capital investment. So there's either these two ways or a combination of the two, I would assume. In the words of Mao himself, to develop industries, we need a large amount of capital. Where can the capital come from? It can only come from these two areas. Mostly rely on our own accumulation, but at the same time seek help from outside. If foreign investments, this is still Mao, are beneficial to the Chinese economy and committed to abide by our laws, we welcome them. So that's Mao Zedong. So bearing this in mind, how do you judge Chinese international trade relationships, which I guess is what you were getting at before? And would you say that they are informed by a logic of mutual cooperation, where Chinese policymakers understand this dialectical role of investment, not only as a tool to sustain domestic capital accumulation, but also as a contribution to the development of partner countries? Or is this just a diplomatic discourse that masks some other interests? I wanted to.
Okay, I'm going to answer by saying two things. Two things. Mao is absolutely right. Capital investment, replicates things. So if you develop a high-speed train, you then need to replicate the investment. You need more high-speed track. You need more locomotives. You need more stations. You need more train drivers. So this is first. But also, it's through capital investment that you raise productivity. By basically investing in products and processes, and improving your comparative efficiency by altering, if you like, your relative costs of production. So that's the first thing. That's vital. Countries that developed later, for the most part, were not able to develop by expropriating the resources of other countries. It makes late development different from early development. But what I would say to you is that it's not just a matter of capital investment, because it requires, this is a quotation, right? Forceful, systematic, and sustained economic intervention by a strong, centralized state pursuing a coherent, long-term development strategy. And I would add that can counter downward tendencies in the profitability of investment. So, capital investment, but also basically a plan-rational state, which is the way in which Japan, Korea, Taiwan, right? The way in which these countries came from behind. That's the first thing that I would say. So I completely agree about the importance of investment, and I think investment in infrastructure and investment in industries in parts of the global south are ways of improving the quality of people's lives, increasing income, raising productivity, enabling them, in a sense, to produce things in which they can participate in an international system. But I said I want to answer it in a second way, and I think you have to try to understand the Chinese vision of a world order, which is different. It's different from the Western vision, because instead of the starting point being anarchy, because of the absence of government in the international system, the starting point in Chinese thought is the principle of harmony. It's the idea that countries should coexist peacefully and cooperate with one another. In China, they speak of these principles. Tianxia, all under heaven, or guanxi, this is relationality, or gongsheng, it means symbiosis. And if you understand these concepts, you will understand Xi Jinping's speeches. Now, when he speaks about a community of common destiny for mankind, or a global development initiative, or a global civilization initiative, or a global security initiative, in the Central Committee of the CPC discussed international affairs in December 1972, right? And Mao Zedong updated 3 strategies that were recommended by Zhu Sheng, right, who was advisor to the first Ming emperor. So we're talking about the 12th century, the end of the Yuan dynasty, the dynasty that ruled China when Marco Polo, traveled to China. Basically, Mao said, dig deep caves, store grain everywhere, and never seek hegemony. And he drew on a traditional distinction in China, basically between a king who rules by benevolence and a tyrant, basically, who rules by power. Ba Chuan in Chinese, right? So, Mao in that meeting insisted that China should never seek hegemony. In Chinese, say, Bu Cheng Ba. And if you listen to Xi Jinping, he also repeatedly says China will never seek hegemony. Although, Mao didn't preclude a benevolent and virtuous rule. But so this is very important. Now, I think, why does it matter? Well, just look at the history of international relations in East Asia. East Asia was at peace for 300 years, basically between 2 Japanese invasions of Korea in the 16th century and in the 19th century. China was at peace for 500 years, right, from a conflict with Vietnam until the late 19th century. In South and East Asia, there were 2 other conflicts in that period, only 2 others, between Myanmar and Thailand. So that part of the world was peaceful because people engaged in trade, tributary trade, and diplomacy in what was essentially a sort of symbiotic system. So this is the vision of what the world, it's the same, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, you go to Zhou Enlai, the same principles. It's the idea of a world in which all nations are equal, in which all nations respect each other, in which one nation doesn't seek to impose its preferred political and economic system on others, but allows them to make their own choices. It's a world in which countries can choose their own development path that suits their own conditions. So you're dealing with a country that has a radically different vision of how the world ought to be organized. I think this is very important because that will shape, all the economic and other relationships between countries if one can actually move in the direction of this type of world. I mean, because frankly, now we live in an absolutely appalling world. I mean, just terrible, terrible things happening all around us. I mean, really, it's got to come to an end. But, I mean, for me, the US is in a struggle to retain hegemony. And it's leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. It's a hard thing to say, but I think it's
just true. Yeah. So I've got another couple of questions, but there's a few people here, and I was wondering if maybe the audience wanted to ask anything. Otherwise, I'm going to carry on with my own stuff. Do you want to ask something? Yeah. Or you want to come here? Vieni qua. So a question from the audience.
Okay.
You want to introduce yourself?
My name is Alessandro Anzani. You had just given a brilliant definition of how China cannot be defined an imperialistic power. But there's another infamous definition of China's system. Someone say that is a state capital, a state capitalism, which I don't agree with. Can you give me your opinion about that? Thank you very much.
Okay. I think probably the most important thing I would say is that capitalism. I mean, when Vera Zasulich asked that question, and when Marx replied, he actually said, at this stage, it is only in Western Europe that one is seeing a movement in the direction of capitalism. And what did he define capitalism as? He defined capitalism as basically the expropriation of effectively the rural population, from ownership of the means of production. Basically, he talked about the proletarianization of, it's the first thing, of the population. Now, I argued earlier that in China, this kind of commodification of labor power, which you can also call it that, is very incomplete. Because, I mean, for example, I mentioned the way rural people own assets. So it's very interesting now because you have contracted land that they can lease their land to someone else, or the collective can use that land. If you live near a city where urban people want to visit for the weekend, then many villages, many communities, establish sort of facilities for children to play, places where people can eat, places where they can drink coffee, drink tea, and so on. And some of these projects are organized collectively. The revenue is shared among all the residents of that village. So what is happening there is that, if you like, their assets are being used. It's not just wage income. The assets are being used in order to generate income streams that can provide revenues, to local people. So I think, the incomplete commodification of labor, the significance of, if you like, multiple channels of income distribution, which Cheng Enfu talks about in his article. These are things that make it very difficult to use the word capitalism to refer to China. Now, you have state-owned enterprises. I mean, the reality is that these enterprises, well, they provide much more secure employment, much better wages. They play a critical role in the provision of infrastructure. They are expected to engage in what is actually everyone, private capitalists as well, is expected to engage in what is called tertiary distribution. Primary distribution is income from work, right? Secondary distribution is after the redistribution through the tax system. Tertiary distribution is that everyone, all these enterprises, are expected to go to poor places and to establish projects, not to make money, but in order to improve the livelihoods of people in these places. This applies to state-owned enterprises. So you can go to Xizang, to Tibet, and you can encounter people, from the prosperous part of China working for, say, state-owned enterprises in that place who establish some projects in these places, basically to improve livelihoods. So this is not a capitalist mechanism of income distribution. Okay, so that I think that's quite important. I think also the political system, the state capital, the state-owned enterprises and the collective enterprises do not control the state. All right, they basically serve the state. So I think, for these reasons, I'm very reluctant to see the use of state capitalism. I mean, actually, I think it was, Mao talked about commodity production, and he said it is something that one can only accept under this is what he said, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Lenin spoke of state capitalism, and you could say the same thing, all right? You could promote state capitalist enterprises, but only under the political control of the democratic government, of the workers and peasants. So I think there's a variety of ways in which one can respond, to that particular claim. Okay.
Thank you
So
very much.
yeah, I guess that it is both a a problem of ownership of the means of production, and also of not falling into this idealistic way where, you know, it's either the abolition of the state is then a socialist country, or because I think that it might still go down to this binary idealistic conception of the very definition of socialism that I think is in the head of a lot of left intellectuals nowadays. I've got
just to comment on that. I mean, I don't think you will ever do away with the administration of things.
Yeah.
And you can't administer everything at a local level. You know, there are things that need to be coordinated at a regional scale, at a national scale, an international scale. So there were, you know, all right, you know, the disappearance of the state. You know, this is what did Marx mean by the state? He was, you know, talking about a system that basically enforces, you know, the social relations of capitalism. So yeah, that type of state obviously should disappear, but you need an administration, you know.
Yes, and I think that, as you said before, the subordination of capital to the policy objectives of the state, of the party,
of the people, really, you know, because you have to have a mechanism through which, you know, but you know, China's it's full of experiments, you know, and all these experiments are monitored, and they get people's opinions of them. And this plays a role, you know. I mean, I know, you know, elections only at the next level up, you know, you elect one level and they elect the next level up, and so on up the system. But there's a huge amount of information collected about responses of people, you know, to these projects, and that profoundly shapes, you know, the choices that are made.
I think I had a very last question, which I think maybe nicely links into this, because it's about like the direction of the state over the evolution of the forces of production, which you refer to in many of your interventions, are about this new technological revolution. So I wanted to ask about what you describe as an oncoming new industrial revolution in the field of clean energy, AI, and the robotization of many sectors that are currently beyond the capacity of the existing robot. So from a Marxian angle, technological progress always operates in a dialectical way. On one hand, if one assumes that the increased productivity of labor does happen in a context of full employment is maintained, we can expect this process to increase the rate of profit. On the other hand, if these innovations are largely labor saving and producing employment, we could be in a situation in which overall rate of profit tends to fall, as value is created only by leaving labor in Marxian theory. So my question is, I hope that it is clear, isn't this analysis valid within the context of only a capitalist society? So in this way, I'm trying to link it to before. So what would be the different role of the fact that this technological revolution is not happening under a capitalist system, whereby I imply the subordination of the decisions of economic development to privately owned capitalist enterprises, as opposed to a situation in which the state and the people ultimately direct this revolution, the technological revolution, possibly to the production of use values and not of exchange values. Hopefully I made myself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, I do think, well, many people think, you know, we're on the verge of new industrial revolution, maybe fourth industrial revolution. And, you know, in that revolution, you know, I mean, China already leads, right, in clean energy, in electric vehicles, in robotics. It may well lead in AI. One reason why is the cost of energy. I mean, China has immense clean energy initiatives, and energy is extremely inexpensive. So, I mean, given that AI requires so much energy, these costs, you know, this is one reason why China has always been so competitiveness. You know, all the utility costs are low. You know, water, electricity, gas, good infrastructure. So that's important, it seems to me. So the impact of this industrial revolution, it basically depends on investment, and it depends on the diffusion of these technologies. Basically they need to spread far and wide. So that the applications, are able to transform the lives of people throughout the world. And that depends on other things. It involves, investment in communications networks and infrastructure. So you have BRI, where you have all these, even, Russia, India, North-South corridor, and so on. And it requires the sharing of technology. I said earlier, I think the question of the sharing of technology and on the conditions on which it's shared is going to be extremely important, especially in relation to the development of the global South and East. In China, this kind of new Xinzhe new quality productive forces. Their development is actually an integrated part of a multi-dimensional modernization path, which they describe as different from the modernization path of the Western world, because it has other dimensions. You just read Cheng Enfu. He speaks about these things. It involves ecological civilization. So transforming the relationship between humanity and nature. It involves spiritual civilization, and development of socialist culture, amongst other things. It involves governance reform. It involves ideological reform, new ways of thinking. So it's sort of envisaged, it involves new urbanization. It involves a new urban-rural relations. So the idea is that it's going to sort of transform, many aspects of life, but, through major programs of investment and replication and so on. But also it offers opportunities, to the rest of the world. Now, the problem with this is, that basically private investment only occurs if capitalists expect a positive rate of return. And in the Western world, profit rates are low. The rate of return on productive investment is low. The rate of investment is low. The United States is trying to address some of these things through what is Inflation Reduction Act to get German companies to go to the United States, right? And its CHIPS Act, trying to get companies to relocate in the US. But then it has problems with the skill profile of its population. It has problems to do with the absence of supply chains and so on. So, the problem for capital is, how do you restore the rate of profit? In economic crises in the past, what happened was that a lot of capital was written off or destroyed. You can say it was what Schumpeter called creative destruction. Now, it's interesting, in China, they discuss that issue, and they have an alternative view, because they say, xian li hou po, which means first build and then destroy. Although, in fact, they don't want to destroy the old, because what they want to do is to renovate the old, make it green, make it digital. So that's the first issue. The question is, how do you finance this investment? And in this case, the existence of a state is extremely important, because in China, the rate of private investment has declined, because as in all developing countries, as the organic composition of capital increases, the rate of profit declines, and then investment declines. And the World Bank says, the problem of the global South is too little, what do they call it? It's about the adoption of new ideas, or the adoption of new technologies. But then what happens, if a country tries to upgrade technologically, you just have to look at the technology restrictions the United States places on China. That's to stop it from upgrading. So, they have to counter, have to deal with this political obstacle. The other problem, is that, especially in the West, the returns from finance, property, real estate, commerce are much higher than the returns from productive investment. So that's where the money flows. Yeah, it doesn't flow, into these industries of the future, and European elites now want to channel it into remilitarization, for God knows what reason, under some myth, about an external threat. So this is, unless you can sort of mobilize investment and undertake research and development, and I mean, in China you have a lot of this venture capital. There's a huge Chinese state venture capital system, that provides investment funds to develop these technologies, develop applications of these technologies, and then the idea is they will diffuse. But the critical question is, can they also diffuse through the rest of the world? All right, and hopefully create a more equal world. On employment, basically, if you increase productivity, that increases value added. And basically, the size and composition of incomes that are distributed to people, in the course of the production of goods and services of all kinds, that in a sense depends on the material investments that are made, the inputs of labor and so on that are made, and then the way in which surplus value is distributed. That in a sense determines the size, the amount of output that can be realized. And your employment problem, it basically depends at an aggregate level. It depends on the relationship between the growth of the employment rate, by which I mean what share of the population work and how many hours they on average work for, and the rate of output growth and the rate of productivity growth. So these are variables on which you can act. I mean, if productivity growth grows fast and output growth grows fast, then employment, you will also create employment. And you'll create employment in the new activities, to replace employment in the activities that disappear, and you'll create new employment for those people, who are displaced by the productivity growth of which you speak. But you can also act on hours of work, all right? Share work, 4 days a week. So these issues have to be addressed, through this kind of policy regime. But basically, improvements in productivity in activities. This is the problem. The problem with the market, is that it doesn't. All that matters is whether someone wants to buy it. It doesn't matter whether it's useful or not, it's a use value or not. I mean, this is one of the serious problems with market-oriented economies. They only basically provide value those things, that people have the wherewithal to buy, and if they want to buy it, it's considered useful, whether it's useful or not. And then the other problem is, that all the structure of prices is seriously distorted by the distribution of income, by extremely uneven distributions of income. So, I mean, I think what I'm saying is, that investment and productivity growth are really the key, to improving income, and that means throughout the world. And that will, could potentially generate employment problems if output growth is not fast enough, or if, there are not changes in, the sharing of work. But these are issues that have to be addressed through these types of reforms. But critically, I think what I'm saying is, that China has a very high rate of investment, and that explains its competitiveness. And that's why it's a competitive challenge also to developing countries, because of its extreme competitiveness, just as it is to Europe as well, and indeed to the United States.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. I think we can wrap it up right now, but let's say that we could summarize your last intervention saying that whereas in a capitalist country, probably the solution would be to work 1 more hour on the few workers that are left, so that you can keep a reserve army of unemployed ready to keep wages also down. Maybe a socialist way to deal with this problem would be to work less and work everybody. So maybe it's a simplistic.
Right. Yeah, okay. If I was in your part of the world, I would be worried about the low productivity growth, and the explosion of a low productivity service economy with low paid, insecure, irregular jobs. I mean, this is You know, these countries, they have to reindustrialize. You know, they have to reindustrialize, and they have to address this issue of productivity. And to do that, I mean, you've probably got to sweep away your existing elites completely. Huh? Well,
all right. Sorry, Mick, but it was a
yeah, I'm
pleasure.
sorry.
It was really a pleasure to have you. And sorry that we were a little bit late at the very beginning.
No problem.
Hopefully next time
Okay.
we'll be efficient. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, brilliant speaking to you, and I hope the rest of the meeting goes very well. Okay, ciao. Bye bye. Okay.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.